Hi everyone, welcome to the booth here at Createx Colors. I'm Chris Arpin, and in this video we're going to talk about intercoat clears. And we're going to cover really the basic topics of when to use them, when not to use them. The two products that we have, we're going to cover them pretty much in depth and kind of discuss pros and cons and kind of give you guys the information that you need to make decisions based upon your technique, your application, how it is that you're spraying, or what exactly you're looking for. So the two products that we recommend the most, right, the two that I have in front of me, our Autoborne Sealer 6000, our transparent sealer, and our 4050 UV-LS gloss. These are the two that we recommend. These are the two that we use quite a bit, and these are the two that we feel work the best. Again, kind of application specific depending on what it is that you're doing. So we'll start with kind of a quick overview. What is an intercoat, right? It's basically a clear base coat, right? So it's something that you would use to protect your artwork. For the most part, that's kind of what is used the most often, I would say, in terms of putting a coat of something over your paint work so you can put it aside if you stop working on it and you're going to be just doing something else, or if you don't have time to finish something. It's kind of just a coat of clear that you can put over the surface to kind of protect, especially if you're doing really intricate airbrush work, really sensitive kind of shading and graphic work where you don't want to be able to basically smudge or manipulate that paint work if you were to come back and wipe it with a cleaner, or let's say it gets dirty. It's just a clear protective coat that you can actually sand. You can wipe it down with a wax and grease remover if you had to. Yeah, the absolute worst case, a mild cleaner. But again, it's something that's going to protect your artwork, give yourself a barrier so that the artwork is kind of sealed up and protected. So again, we have the two products that we recommend, our 6000 sealer and our 4050. If you're familiar with those, and if you're not familiar, we're going to kind of discuss them right now. So our 6000 is a little bit thinner in terms of viscosity, right? So I have a cup in front of me here. It's a little bit thinner. I don't know if you can see that, how it flows off the stick. It's a little bit lower in viscosity. Now this is like a single resin coating, right? It's based on all of our Autoborne sealers are, so it's a single resin, very strong, very durable, leveling characteristics are phenomenal. Now 4050 is a little bit thicker. I don't know if you can see how. It still flows off the stick, but you can see it in the beginning, it's just a little more sluggish. This is a thicker viscosity, it's a thicker coating. So in order for this to lay down nice and smooth, it's going to have to be applied a little bit heavier. And that's where it kind of goes into what we talked about in terms of application specific. If you're doing an entire panel, edge to edge, both of these are going to work perfectly fine. If you're looking for something a little bit thicker in viscosity to kind of bury tape lines or graphic lines, the 4050 is going to work a little bit better just because it has more body, right? It's going to have a little bit more mill thickness, mill build when you're applying it, because you're going to give yourself enough material to kind of level out those tape lines. Or if you had to go back and sand, you just have more material, right, per coat basically, as opposed to the 6000. The 6000 is a little bit less in viscosity, but it sprays a little bit cleaner. I call it cleaner. Levels a little bit better when it's not super heavy in terms of your application. So that basically says that the 6000 is going to be a little better suited for smaller tip size spray guns and airbrushes even at that point, especially with reduction at 10%, which is that we recommend across the board for all of our paints. So 10% reducer, this is going to spray a little bit easier out of an airbrush, small tip size spray gun. You're not going to be able to have to apply it as wet or as heavy to get kind of that nice uniform even flow out and finish. And sometimes that's exactly what you want. If you're doing something, you're not trying to build serious layers of paint, it's just something to go over that surface, this is going to be better suited for that because, again, it doesn't have that increased viscosity. You don't have to put it on as heavy to get that nice uniform flow out. The leveling characteristics of all our sealers, and this included, are fantastic in terms of lighter applications, right? I don't mean dry spray, but just a lighter application of paint. Now, the opposite of that, the 4050, again, it's going to be a little bit more sluggish in a smaller tip size where you might have to go up in your reduction. You might have to go 20%. We really don't recommend it in an airbrush. It's not best suited for that. Now you can obviously over-reduce it at that point, but at that, you're kind of defeating the purpose in spraying a thicker product through your airbrush, right? So even if you had to go 30, 40%, it's really not going to be as effective as something like the 6000. So that's kind of one of the first major difference we're going to talk about in terms of when to use it, when not to use it. Obviously, the viscosity of the product. So going on to basically the next step in terms of like what I mentioned in terms of coverage, right? So the 6000 sealer is a phenomenal product, what we call edge to edge, right? You have a panel basically going from, like if this was the table was my panel, right? From front to back and side to side. It covers extremely well, goes on nice and smooth and even, it dries extremely fast, and it has a very good hold down in terms of that edge to edge. Now where it kind of suffers in performance is if you're doing taping, right? So if you are taping out with fine line or graphic tape and you have a lot of edges, a lot of really tight corners and lines that you want to basically have as graphics, putting a wet or medium wet coat of sealer or building that up with a few coats, sometimes when you pull that tape, it won't cut as clean. When we say cut, we mean, you know, the tape won't pull a nice, clean, fine line through that sealer because it is, again, that's what makes it a great product. It's really, really tough in terms of holding down and holding across your panel. The 4050 is actually a little better suited to that. It's a little more flexible. It kind of gives a little bit more of a tear or a cut from the fine line tape versus the 6000. So that's another thing to keep in mind. If you guys are spraying flakes or dry pearls, if you're adding something or using this to kind of mix your own custom color, the increased viscosity of the 4050 would be better suited just to encapsulate that flake and help kind of lay that flake down so it doesn't stand up. So anytime that you would be in an issue where you want a little bit thicker coverage or really spraying something that requires the higher viscosity, that's when we would recommend the 4050. And obviously the opposite of that, anytime you're looking for less millage, less thickness, that's where we'd recommend the 6000. Okay guys, welcome back. Real quick before we move on to reducing and spraying, I wanted to talk quickly about one of the attributes basically of the 6000, right? So in front of me I have this panel. This is a panel with our Autoborn Silver Sealer, which is a great silver product. This side is just the Silver Sealer neat, and this side, the side that looks a little bit darker, has one coat, only one coat of our Sealer 6000 over the top. Now I don't know if you can hear it, but you can kind of hear it's a little bit more, it's not so much textured, but you can definitely hear the difference in the slickness of the surface. So this is going to benefit, especially if you're going to go ahead and do some real intricate taping or some graphics over the top and using fine line tape. And anytime you have a metallic color that has the chance that it's going to kind of be an uneven surface, this is going to help you just kind of slick that surface out and level out extremely well, and it's going to give you a nice even surface for you to spray your graphics and do your tape outs over the top. Now, another benefit of this is if I had some imperfections, now I have a piece of 800 right here, right? So if I had some imperfections in the surface, if I were to sand this, I'll go ahead and do it, right, versus the 6000. Now these both look the same, right? But the problem is, when I go ahead and spray some clear over this, if this was the finished product, you would see these sand scratches. When you sand base coat, as you can see on the paper, it's turning gray. So anytime, and this goes with any base coat, you're going to see the scratches in that base coat when you put clear over it. That does not go away, versus sanding the clear, right? This is going to disappear. If I put a coat of clear over this, this is going to look like it did over here, nice and slick and clean, and you're going to see these sand scratches. So that's another thing to keep in mind. Another great attribute of when to use an inner coat. If you were taking this panel, putting it off to the side, and you're worried, oh, they got some surface contamination, this would be a perfect time to do something like that. So, all right, welcome back. We are going to talk about reduction now. So in front of me, I have the 6000 and our 4050 on this side here, and 6000 here, and 4011 reducer, right? So if you're familiar with our paint, 4011, that's our go-to for everything from the sealers across all of our colors and into our 4050, our UVLS clears. So for both of these, we're recommending 10%. So we're going to go ahead, and I have 4 ounces in each cup. So I'm going to go 10%. That one. I'm going to go ahead and stir this up. And if you're not familiar with our paint, what we recommend is really mixing this and letting this sit for about 10 to 15 minutes, because water-based paint takes reducer a little bit differently than solvent. Solvent, if you hit it with a reducer, you can kind of almost instantly see it knocks down the viscosity, where the water-based paint systems tend to kind of not so much reject it, but it kind of floats to the surface. So really mixing this and letting it sit and letting everything get acclimated It will give you a much better result than just hitting this right now and putting this in a spray gun and spraying it. You will see a difference in performance just by letting this sit on your bench for about 10 to 15 minutes. So if you had to tack something off or clean something off or get everything set up or go tape out, whatever it is you're doing, that's a perfect time for you to kind of let this sit on your bench, go do your thing, and then come back and be ready to spray. So that's 10% here. You can see the viscosity, nice and smooth off the stick. Nice even flow. It's not hanging like it was originally, and it's not dripping kind of like I call it staccato, where it's just really, really thin. So that's a huge, huge thing you want to see. So that's 10% there. Now we're moving over to the 40-50. It's going to be the exact same amount. There's 4 ounces in this cup. So there's 10% right there. And I'm not sure. Again, you got to mix this up. I don't know if you can see it. You can almost see it kind of doesn't quite mix together until right about now. At first, it kind of floats to the surface. Again, that's why we stress really mixing this up and letting it sit. And then when you come back before you put it in your gun, just give it a quick little stir again for about 30 seconds to a minute, just to make sure everything's nice and mixed well. But I want to see if we can show you the viscosity here versus definitely a little bit thinner, which is not surprising in that 6000 because it is a lower viscosity product right off the bat. So we're gonna let these sit for a couple more minutes. I'm gonna grab a panel and we'll do a little mini jam gun here. This is a 1.2 LPH 80 with a 1.2 with the E4 cap, so it's a good size fan. We'll do a little bit of spraying. All right guys, welcome back. We have our 6000. Remember, it sat for about 15 minutes and we mixed it up there. It's in my gun, 1.2, like I mentioned before, 1.2 LPH 80. Spraying right at the recommended air pressure, right around 15, 16 PSI. And you can see I have my super sophisticated matrix here, so we can show, and it's pretty self-explanatory. We have our 6000 with a minigun, and over here we're going to do 40-50 with a minigun as well, and then we'll do 6000 with an airbrush, and then we'll do 40-50 with an airbrush. So this is the 6000, and I'm going to apply this kind of just like the way I recommend, just a medium wet coat, nice and even, and that's what that looks like. All right guys, welcome back. So this is the first coat. That would be one coat. That's where I would stop. You can see I kind of moved fairly quick. So hand speed was pretty fast, and it lays down really nice. And I'd be happy with that. That would be what I would consider just one medium coat of an inner coat. Now, this is the 40-50. So it's basically, it's not going to be as dramatic a difference with a spray gun, like a minigun or a large spray gun, because it's a little bit larger tip size that's going to allow it to move. I'm going to have to slow down slightly to get this to kind of level and flow the same way that 6000 did. Where it's going to be more apparent when we switch over to the airbrush. That's going to be the big difference. So you can probably see, which I can tell, right? Definitely a little bit slower. It's pretty obvious how much slower I am to get that same medium wet type of finish. Okay guys, we're done. The 40-50 is drying, and now we're going to switch to the airbrush. So for this is definitely on the smaller side of what we recommend. This is an Eclipse, and I want Eclipse with a 3.5. So that's really the limit. We typically recommend kind of a 0.5 is kind of like the absolute smallest, but a 3.5 is going to work. So this is the 6000. So I'm going to show you guys this. I'm not over reducing this thing anymore. This is right out of that cup that we sprayed with our minigun. So I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing and show you guys. Again, I don't know if you can see, but it's moving fairly well. It's certainly going to be slower because it's a 3.5 versus a 1.2, but I can move fairly fast with this guy wide open. My fingers all the way back, and I'm backed off a little bit to really allow the fan of this airbrush to do its thing. But that would be a medium coat of 6000 with the Eclipse. All right guys, we are back. 6000 is drying. Now I have my clean Eclipse, and we are going to pour out the 40-50. So again, you can see it's going to be a little bit thicker coming out of that cup. So this most certainly would be something that I don't think we would quite recommend in terms of spraying I really have to slow down to keep a nice wet edge. And again, this is what I would consider medium wet, and I really have to slow down. So there's two things at this point that are going to be working against you. Basically your overlap and a larger amount of dry spray because of that. I don't know if you can see it. We're going to get this closer to the camera afterwards. There's a pretty intense amount of dry overspray. It kind of looks like white pearl on the edges of this panel. So I'm not even going to continue going all the way to the bottom because I think that kind of illustrates how much slower and how much more sluggish, which is why we don't recommend 40-50 in a small tip size. Now you could go ahead and reduce this. Again, this was 10%. You can over-reduce this and you could get this to flow fairly nice. But the problem is now you're just kind of reducing the viscosity of that 40-50 where realistically, going back to the 6000 at the same reduction at 10%, it's going to fare that much better. So really, again, this kind of illustrates why we don't recommend 40-50 through a smaller tip size. So we're going to let the booth clear out. We'll bring this panel close to the camera. We can show you guys exactly what it is we're talking about when these are dry. And we'll wrap this one up. So we'll see you guys in a little bit. All right, guys, we are back. The panel is totally dry. So now we can kind of show you guys. We're not sure how well you can see it on camera, but I think you're going to hear it pretty well. I think that'll be pretty apparent. So starting from the very first, this is the 6000 with the minigun, right? Really nice and smooth, slick, laid down extremely well. The edges of this, kind of where it transitioned into this black, it's a nice smooth transition, right? I can hear that's actually just the surface of the black. It's not overspray, but it's a nice even transition. The 40-50, as you remember, I sprayed it. I had to slow it down a little bit. This was a relatively fast hand speed in terms of application, and it looks really nice and smooth. 40-50 is smooth as well, but you did see I had to slow it down. I had to throttle it back a little bit in terms of my speed just to keep a nice wet edge. And just because of the nature of a product that's a higher viscosity, it has a little bit more of an edge in terms of texture, like overspray, right, where I stopped. So again, this would be something that's better suited for an overall, again, just because of the thickness and the viscosity of the material. So moving on to the airbrush at the bottom, same thing. This is 10% reduction with the 6000 with a 3.5 Eclipse, which is really, again, like I mentioned, the smallest tip size we recommend, really smooth. You saw I was able to move quite fast, not as fast as I would want to, but it definitely was not holding back. And again, this edge, this transition is relatively smooth. I don't have a lot of overspray. I don't see anything. And I actually mentioned that when I was spraying the 40-50. Again, the middle is fairly smooth, but these edges are pretty rough, and you can actually see it's got white overspray, right? And that's just because this product is so thick at 10% reduction, the airbrush is really struggling to atomize, and some of the outside of that fan, it's just too dry in terms of application. So food for thought. We kind of mentioned that in the very beginning. It's one of the reasons that we really don't recommend the 40-50 product in a smaller tip size airbrush, because you are going to fight that. The speed and the way it flows, it's just going to be really, really thick because that's a thicker product. So that kind of wraps this portion up. I just want to touch on two things real quick. In the beginning, I talked about the 6000 sealer in terms of not over applying it when you are going to use it as an inner coat. And one of the things I wanted to mention was it works extremely well for doing graphic tape outs if you want to kind of prevent tape bleed or paint creep under the tape, right? So I know it's kind of counterintuitive what I said. It tears sometimes more than it does clean in terms of untaping. That's only when you over apply. So if I were to spray over this and I was going to spray so heavy that I couldn't feel the transition of this tape versus the surface of the clear, it's definitely going to give you problems. But that's really not the proper use of that product for something like that. If you do a nice medium coat like we have here, what that's going to do is kind of fill any kind of surface imperfections, little microscopic pores in the paint, especially when you're doing pearls and metallics. They kind of have more of a texture rather than just a smooth paint surface. And what that's going to do is it's going to lock up the edge of that tape. So when you do go over with the next color, if you were to have anything that would bleed through there, it's going to be clear, and it's not going to be that color and give you a jagged line. But again, it's imperative that you don't over apply this. You can see less is more. Medium coat and walk away. If you over apply, it's going to cause more problems than you want to have. So the last thing I want to talk about is one of the questions we do get quite a bit too is the flake carrier, right? So we have hot rod sparkle, we have cosmic sparkle, so we have large pearl flake versus small pearl flake. I always recommend a 40-50 for something like that, just because you have more body, right? Thicker viscosity of a product to kind of encapsulate that flake, and it's going to help it lay down a little smoother. It's not going to stand up. It's going to let the flake kind of be encapsulated, and the weight of the flake will kind of help settle it down so you don't have a funky looking flake. And that's always been my recommendation. If you're doing something with an airbrush, typically you're not going to be able to spray Hot Rod Sparkle Flake through anything smaller than a 0.5, and even 0.5 is like right on the cusp, for what we recommend. So keep that in mind. It's going to spray a little bit better because it's a 0.5, not a 0.35. But if you were doing Cosmic, it's it's more of a pearl, smaller flake size than the Hot Rod, you might be able to get away with it with a 6000. But for me personally, what I recommend is I like the 40-50 across the board. I just like its ability to hold that flake and spray it. I just prefer that. But again, it's kind of user preference. So the more you guys were to use these products, you can kind of decide for yourselves, along in conjunction with what we talked about in this video. It's kind of to highlight the pros and cons of each, and you guys can make your own decisions based on that. It's more application and technique specific. So there really is no right or wrong. It's just how you're mixing, how you're spraying, and the reduction. So I think that wraps that up. So for Createx Colors, I'm Chris Arpin, and thanks for checking us out. We'll see you guys next time.